Hello friends, and welcome to the Scott Joplin International Ragtime Foundation's online mini festival. Yeah, we couldn't get together in person in Sedalia, Missouri as we normally do this year, so we're doing the next best thing and trying to bring you a little taste of the festival in the comfort of your own home or wherever you may happen to be. My name is Bryan Wright. I am the Artistic Director for the Scott Joplin International Ragtime Festival, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you here this evening. To give you a little taste of what's to come, we'll be hearing some performances by two remarkable ragtime composers/pianists in this first hour. We'll have a few awards after that, and then Bill Edwards will lead a symposium looking at the music of women in ragtime. So that's what's on tap tonight, and then be sure and set your alarm or your calendar or whatever it is and come back tomorrow night when we'll have more performances and more symposium for you. So tonight and tomorrow night, we've got a lot on tap. So let's get right to it. As you probably know, ragtime music, the focus of the Scott Joplin International Ragtime Foundation, burst on the scene as America's preeminent popular music in the 1890s. It hybridized European classical musical elements along with African American musical traditions and has just become such an important part of America's musical heritage. We all think it's worth preserving and performing, and so that's what we're here to do. Ragtime flourished through the first decades of the 20th century, but it never truly went away. Performers and pianists have found a lot of satisfaction in playing and writing this music in the years since, and I have a heads up notice that we'll be hearing some rags old and some rags new on this evening's program and on tomorrow's program as well. So the whole gamut of ragtime, old and new, on tap this weekend. I'm so glad you could tune in and join us, and we're going to get right down to it now with a performer who comes to you from New England, and I hope she won't mind me showing you this, but I first encountered her when I was in college and just getting interested in ragtime music, and I found this LP that she made. Her name is Virginia Eskin, and she made this wonderful album called Pickles and Peppers and Other Rags by Women, and it was a real eye-opening and ear-opening experience for me to hear this ragtime music that wasn't from Scott Joplin or Joseph Lamb or James Scott, good as that is, but some really tuneful, just delightful music on this album, and that opened the doors to just a wealth of additional ragtime music by women. Nora Hulse, Nan Bostic, there have been others that have championed the music of women in ragtime, but Virginia Eskin is just a remarkable lecturer and pianist. She has performed all over the world, and I'm so pleased that she's here with us this evening. So we'll take it to Virginia Eskin now.
Hello, my name is Virginia Eskin, and I'm here at the Keene Public Library, and I'm going to be playing 7 rags for the Sedalia Ragtime Festival. I'm going to start off with a rag called Dusty. It was composed by May Aufderheide, and she was the queen of ragtime. Her father published a lot of her rags, and she was best known coming from Indianapolis. This was her first rag, and I'm sorry to say that after marriage, she quit music, but let's enjoy Dusty. now I'm going to play Possum Rag, which was composed by Geraldine Dobbins, and her dates are 1883 and 1956. Just like After Heidi, similar time period, 1888, although she lived much longer, to 1972. And little is known about Dobbins. This possum rag just reflects food, and that was a very common theme in rags that women composed. You know, supposed to be barefoot and in the kitchen. Next rag is going to be Red Peppers. Again, a food title, and it was composed by Imogene Giles, who lived from 1877 to 1964. And she only published this one rag in 1907. Red Peppers. play a rag that was composed by a living woman. Her name is Judith Zemont. She was born in 1940. It's called Judy's Rag, and Judith has received many awards: Guggenheim, NEA, ASCAP. She created a series called The Musical Woman, and she lives in Maricopa, Arizona now, is teaching and gets a lot of major commissions. And I love this rag because it's in a very odd key, A flat minor. Most of the rags are in very sprightly major keys, and this one is sophisticated because of the key that she chose. Has a different flavor than the old-timey rags. Now I'd like to play an old-fashioned one. It's called Chicken Chowder by Irene Giblin. She worked in a department store playing rags. They were called piano girls. She's playing sheet music. And this rag was published in 1905. Apparently she gave up writing music when she had a family. And I like this little quote. Her son remembers that she was an extremely talented pianist, and she played all types of music, not just ragtime, but classical. So this one reflects a real pianist because it's got all kinds of runs. You'll hear it. two-step. And a two-step is different than a march, but apparently they're similar. So I guess, a rag has this syncopated quality, and a two-step you could actually dance to. Now I'd like to share a rag that was composed by a friend of mine, Marjorie Merriman. It's called Dog Day Rag. Marjorie was born in 1951, and she's also very accomplished. Studied at Tanglewood and has received many commissions. She went to Brandeis. She taught at Boston University, and now she teaches at the Manhattan School of Music. And I commissioned this rag from Marjorie for one of my CD albums. And it's a pleasure to play, although you really have to concentrate because it's extremely chromatic. And you'll hear it. It's not Joplin-esque, but it's very, very beautiful. And the title reflects the days in August that are very, very hot, where they're called Dog's Day. So, and her father had just died. So it's very poignant, this rag. I love to play it. And now my last rag is one of the most famous ones. It's called Pickles and Peppers. Here's a copy of the sheet music that Max Morath gave me. You can see the dill peppers. And Adeline Shepard lived in 1883, and then she lived till 1950. That's a long life for, somebody born way back before the 1900s. William Jennings Bryan used this rag in his 1908 presidential campaign. It made her a rich woman, sold something like 300,000 copies. She had 3 children. She played even when she had arthritis. And this last bit, I don't care for so much because the family considered her music not very good. So, poo on them. I love playing this, and I often play it as an encore after a major concerto. Pickles and Peppers. Thank you very much.
Wow. Thank you, Virginia Eskin, for that delightful set. That Pickles and Peppers is such a rousing rag. I always love hearing that. And Judy's rag was really quite beautiful, a fine example of what people have been doing with ragtime in the years since the ragtime era. Once again, everyone, Virginia Eskin. And folks, if you're enjoying tonight's program, I'd encourage you to stop by the Scott Joplin Foundation's website, which is www.scottjoplin.org/donate, and there you can contribute a few dollars or whatever you're comfortable with to help out the musicians you see in tonight's program. As you know, many of them have lost a lot of work over the past year and a half because of the pandemic, so we're grateful for your generosity. 100% of all donations collected will go directly to the musicians, so thank you for considering that. Again, the website, www.scottjoplin.org/donate. You can use your credit card online, or you'll find an address where you can mail a check if you'd prefer to go that route. Okay, in just a few moments, we'll have another remarkable pianist for you. But before then, I'd like to present the 2020 Scott Joplin Foundation's Lifetime Achievement Award. As many of you know, every year the Scott Joplin Foundation awards this to a person who has made extraordinary contributions in the field of ragtime, either as a performer or as a scholar or all-around promoter. And I think you'll agree this year's recipient is quite deserving. And rather than tell you who it is, I'd like to turn it over to some friends of this individual who will introduce him. And here it is.
It is an honor to announce that the 2021 Scott Joplin Ragtime Foundation's 37th Annual Outstanding Achievement Award is presented posthumously to honor the career of Bryan Cather.
Bryan had more enthusiasm for ragtime than virtually anybody.
He was a very unique kind of guy, and I never in my life met anyone who was as dedicated as Bryan when it came to the Scott Joplin House or Ragtime or even the Rosebud Cafe.
By working with him, I probably learned the most about the site, about Scott Joplin, and about ragtime history.
As president of Friends of Scott Joplin, Bryan did pretty much all the work. He was most proud of his euphonic review, and I think we all were, and that was a lot of work, and he did out of a labor of love.
He would do his assigned work, and when it came time for him to take his break or take his lunch, he would grab his computer and start doing research.
Just about any time I would ever stumble across him at a concert or at a Joplin house, he would always tell me of some new thing that he discovered, some interesting new avenue to research.
Some of Bryan's research included learning about the Bonson family of Bonson pianos. What he was really interested in was why that Bonson Piano Company had published several of Scott Joplin's works, such as Bink's Waltz and Bethina.
Bryan Cather in particular was highly motivated for public history.
Bryan and I taught together at the high school that I work for on a lesson about ragtime blues and jazz, and the kids really enjoyed the time period correct gramophone he brought and used as a prop.
I first got to know Bryan at the University of Missouri St. Louis when he was an undergraduate student in the history department, and I was working on my graduate degree in history.
Got his bachelor's degree and was still working on his master's at the time that he died.
He was really getting going, and it was one of the sad things about him dying so suddenly.
Through the Friends of Scott Joplin, he facilitated so much amazing music.
Bryan organized the Ragtime Afterglow, which always followed the Sedalia Festival.
For the ragtime community, such as it is, so spread out all over, we only get together a few times a year if we're lucky, and so it was such a great thing to have Bryan in town because he would always host pianists, he would always try to bring pianists through, and he really strengthened the bond of community in the ragtime scene, and that's really important.
Bryan was an expert on piano roll history and on specifically St. Louis sheet music publishing history. Whenever I remember Bryan, I always picture him sitting at the player piano, pedaling away with some wonderful piece of ragtime playing.
Bryan is perhaps most remembered as a valuable mentor to young musicians and composers. He actively encouraged and supported.
I feel sad for all those young kids who were looking up to him that they lost him in their life.
Clinton Gray comes to mind, and a young man from Iowa comes to mind.
Well, I can't think of anyone who is more deserving of this award than Bryan.
Aside from Edward Berlin, Bryan had become the chief researcher of Scott Joplin.
You will never find another guy that is as dedicated as Bryan was to his job, to the house, and to ragtime.
Bryan is so missed in the St. Louis community.
Bryan wasn't just my colleague, he was one of my friends.
We will all miss him.
I'd be hard-pressed to think of anyone more deserving of the Scott Joplin Foundation's Lifetime Achievement Award than Bryan Cather. My thanks to his friends and colleagues for that moving tribute video. We lost such a good friend and scholar and mentor when Bryan died unexpectedly last year. I looked forward to seeing him every year at the Scott Joplin Festival in Sedalia, and at that afterglow party that he would organize afterwards in St. Louis. We'll all miss Bryan terribly. In case you're just joining us, this is Festival Friday, part of an online mini-festival presented by the Scott Joplin International Ragtime Foundation. And we're celebrating women in ragtime tonight. And obviously, I don't quite qualify for that. I could play some pieces composed by women, but instead, I like to invite a very important ragtime woman in my life, actually two of them, my wife Yuko and my daughter Kiki.
Hi everybody, long time no see!
So, say hi.
Hi.
We actually had worked up a number we were going to perform at the 2019 Scott Joplin International Ragtime Festival, and we were this close to doing it, and it came this close to the time when Kiki was born, so Yuko was unable to attend that year, so we've had to hold this song in reserve, but we'd like to play it for you now. It's a pop song from about 1921 that harkens back to one of the first ragtime songs, a thing called You're a Good Old Wagon, But You Done Broke Down. And here it's been sort of updated for the Model T era and given the title, You're a Good Old Car, But You Can't Climb Hills. So, Yuko, are you ready?
I think so. We'll see how it happens.
The kind of song you'll only hear at the Scott Joplin Festival.
Yeah, right. Look here, Jefferson Lee, you mean nothing to me. Your lab slipped from an A1 brand clear down to an XYZ. When you came here to board, talk of loving, oh Lord, you started like a Rolls Royce with me, but you ended like a Ford. Your baby's gone, far, far away, so travel on, you've lost your day. There was a time when I liked your kissing, but now your motor is missing. You and Hinton on all four, no more, you're out of gas. Can't even start, you couldn't pass a spring clean cart. We poured, what I need is some speed. Go to get my loving thrills. You're a good old car, but you can't climb hills. Your baby's gone, far, far away, so trouble yawn. You've lost your day. One time your kiss just burned like a fire, but now you've got a flat tire. Oh, your love has skidded too. A ski-doo just detour. You've lost your thrills. There's just one cure for all your ills. Some pills. You were grand, now you're kin. Go and get a monkey gland. You were a good old car, but you can't climb hills. Bryan Wright. Listen, Jefferson Lee, why I'm setting you free. Once you're labby, once A-OK, but now it's a big NG. When I think of the past, away. So travel on, you've had your day. One time your speed was 40 horsepower, but now it's 1 kiss an hour. Your battery's done gone dry. Goodbye, so long, old dear. The word I'm large. You can park here in my garage. Give the hands, jump the fence, rest among the daffodils. You're a good old car, but you can't climb hills.
You're a good old car, but you can't climb hills. Believe it or not, at the 2019 Joplin Festival, where Yuko could not attend, I actually got to sing that with the accompaniment of my friend Martin Spitznagel. I don't think it came out quite as well. But a gentleman did come up to me afterwards and tell me that, you know, back in about 1920, it was very common for cars to get to hills and run into trouble because they had a gravity-fed gas line. So once you started going up the hill, all that gas ran to the bottom of the car and wasn't feeding the engine. So it was common to have to turn cars around and back them up the hill so that you still had enough fuel in the fuel line to feed the engine. So interesting little side note there that you learn about when you come to the Scott Joplin International Ragtime Festival. This is the Scott Joplin Ragtime Festival online, a little mini version of it for 2021 since we still couldn't get together this year. We do hope to resume the in-person festival next year in 2022. You can find out more details about that on the Scott Joplin Foundation's website, which is www.scottjoplin.org. We already had that wonderful, wonderful set from Virginia Eskin, and I know you're going to enjoy our next performer, who's out in California. She hails originally from Russia, and she discovered ragtime, as I understand it, while she was living in San Antonio some years ago. She attended activities sponsored by the San Antonio Ragtime Society there and started playing rags and composing rags, and she continued doing that when she moved to Philadelphia for a few years and then out to California, where she now works as a lawyer and still finds time to raise a daughter, Clara, and to play ragtime, compose ragtime. She's a marvelous, marvelous musician and a really good friend, a really wonderful person to get to meet. I'd like to turn it over now to Larissa Miguetchoff from her home out in California.
you for tuning in to my concert. I am thrilled and honored to be participating in the online Joplin Festival. I wish it were in person, but the online festival is still much better than no festival at all. Thank you to the Scott Joplin Foundation for organizing it. I am also very honored to be following the awards ceremony. Both Brian Cather and Nevin Almquist richly deserve their awards. Today, my program is dedicated to music by female composers. And since I am a female composer of ragtime, I hope you forgive me the self-indulgence of including mostly music by me. There will be music by other people as well, don't worry. The song that I just played for you is actually one that I wrote in COVID quarantine while sitting around at home and homeschooling my child. This one was actually inspired by my daughter Clara, who says that the world needs more animal dances, and who named this one The Dancing Rats. The next tune that I will play for you is one that I wrote in honor of Joseph Lamb. I tried to echo his style, and it's called Lamb Chop, and dedicated to his daughter Patricia Lamb Kahn, who I was really hoping to see at the Scott Joplin Festival, but I guess all I can do is play for her online. So Pat, wherever you are, this one is for you. Next, I'd like to play for you a tune I wrote for my teacher, mentor, and dear friend, Mimi Blay. This one was written for a Halloween concert that she was giving, and it's called Pumpkin Bread. So as I mentioned earlier, I am not going to be so self-indulgent as presumptuous as to only include pieces by me. Here are two classic rags by female ragtime composers. I'm going to first play Gravel Rag by Charlotte Blake, written in 1908, and then I'll play the beautiful Red Rambler Rag by Julia Lee Niebergall, written in 1914. So the next tune is, once again, one of my own compositions. This one is a kind of unusual form called a half and half, which is a piece in 5/4 time. It was popularized by Vernon and Irene Castle in the 19-teens. And it is very difficult to dance to, as I found out when I played this at one of the festivals. So this one is named after two different types of cheese, and it is called the Gruyere and Vacherin half and half. thank you once again to the Scott Joplin Foundation for including me in this wonderful festival, and thank you all for tuning in. I really appreciate it, and I hope to see you all in person at the Scott Joplin Festival next year. My last song is going to be dedicated to the memory of all the ones we have lost to COVID this year. I originally wrote it in memory of John Gill, and it's called Eucalyptus Dreams.
Thank you, Larissa, for that really enjoyable set, and what a treat to see Clara as well. Everybody, Larissa Miguetchoff here on the Scott Joplin Foundation's online mini festival. I encourage you to stick around. In just a few moments, I'll hand it over to Bill Edwards for this evening's symposia, looking a little more deeply into the music of Women Composers in Ragtime. That'll be coming up in just a few moments. But before we get to that, a reminder that you can contribute to help out the musicians you see in tonight's program by going to www.scottjoplin.org/donate. A lot of the musicians you see have lost work over the past year and a half because of the pandemic, and your contributions are very helpful and appreciated by everyone. So 100% of your donations go directly to the artists you see in this evening's program, so thank you for your generosity. Before we get to this evening's symposia, though, I do want to turn it over to Nancy Moss for the presentation of the 2020 Scott Joplin Foundation Chrysanthemum Award.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Nancy Moss, and I was the inaugural Chrysanthemum Award winner in 2019. Today, I'm pleased to announce the 2020 winner of this award, Nevin Almquist. Nevin has been very involved in the Scott Joplin Ragtime Festival since the early 1990s. He became a board member of the Scott Joplin Ragtime Foundation in 2003 and served until 2014. He served in various important capacities. He was president from 2007 to 2009, vice president from 2009 to 2011, then again as our president from 2011 to 2014. Nevin was the festival's do-all, be-all with a hammer and saw, fix-anything man. He was the first board member to waken every morning of the festival, starting on Wednesday, which was our setup day. He supervised and worked along with the crews to set up the indoor and outdoor venues, including tents, stages, tables, chairs, pianos, and sound systems. Once on the scene, he was moving all day long, acting as unofficial plumber, fireman, or diplomat, depending upon the problem at hand. He was the last board member to head home at night after checking on the festival venues to make sure everything was secure. Then he and his wife and daughter would host after hours until the wee hours of the morning at the Best Western Motel. He would grab a little bit of sleep and then be back at the festival at the crack of dawn that next day to do it all over again. In view of his decades of work and devotion to the Ragtime Festival here in Sedalia, I'm very happy and proud to present the 2020 Chrysanthemum Award posthumously to Nevin Almquist. Present here tonight with us are Nevin's wife Jeannie and his daughter Denise. Nevin will always be in our hearts and our fond ragtime memories of you. Rest in peace, dearest friend.
Thank you for honoring Nevin's enjoyment and dedication to the Scott Joplin Festival. He always tried to make sure that everything was just right for the performers and the patrons. He was dedicated to the festival as he was to his family and his profession, always willing to go the extra mile with a smile.
Another friend of ragtime that many of us miss very much, Nevin Almquist. He did so much for the Scott Joplin Foundation, and I remember some years ago when I was the artist in residence for the Joplin Foundation. I came to Sedalia for a week in the wintertime, and Nevin drove me all over town, and my wife, to all the various engagements, and we had so much fun visiting in the car and going out to dinner, and we all miss him very much as well. In just a few moments, we'll have our evening symposia directed by Bill Edwards. But before then, I want to remind you that you can come back tomorrow night, Saturday night at the same time, for more music and for more performances from some extraordinary ragtime musicians. We'll also have another symposium tomorrow night. That's same time, same place. I hope you'll join us then and tell some friends who may enjoy tuning in as well. Before I sign off for the evening, though, one more plea for your contributions. If you're enjoying the programming, www.scottjoplin.org/donate. You can throw a few dollars this way that'll help all of the musicians you see in this weekend's programs. Okay, at this point, I'd like to turn it over to Bill Edwards, who will be hosting a symposium looking at the music of women in ragtime. So, Bill, over to you.
ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the symposia portion of this year's Scott Joplin Internet Ragtime Festival. We're doing what we can this year with our online presence. Hope you've enjoyed what you've seen so far. There's more coming. My name is Bill Edwards. I am your Symposia Director, and usually we have a wide variety, 6 or 7 different topics to bring you. This year we are limited because of format to but 2, and tonight will be the first one, a subject that is near and dear to my heart. So let's get our grand opening here as we pull back the curtain and we see our topic for the evening, which I think is prescient at almost any time, but particularly lately. Women in Ragtime and Tin Pan Alley, hurrahs and heartbreaks, the stories of triumph and loss from America's first true musical production center. So I'd like to preface this to say that there are no men that are experts on women. I mean, it's a universal thing. You've heard Doc Brown in Back to the Future, the great mystery, women. But I am qualified to some degree to talk about them. I've been researching them for a long time. My mother was a woman, bless her soul, and my wife also very much. So I've had some experience. I cannot emote for them. I cannot tell you what they felt in terms of joy and maybe sadness, but I can tell you that there are a lot of things I have found out about them, especially how hard it was for them to get by in a male-dominated world. And this is a century ago, much less now, 120 years ago. So we're going to talk about some of these stories, and I will start with that, with the origins of Tin Pan Alley. We need to know where this comes from before we do a whole lot else. So, the origins of Tin Pan Alley. Where did it come from? Where is it? Well, here's what we know. After the Ball was published in Boston, which is not New York, which is not Tin Pan Alley. It's by Charles K. Harris, who is not pictured in the big picture. He's in the little one down in the lower corner of the cover. Mr. Harris wrote what many consider to be the first million-selling piece and the start of writing music on demand, so it were, or to look at what the public is interested in. Theaters and entertainment districts started to grow with the advent of better transportation and electricity. This is in the 1890s into the early the 1900s. The publishers were setting up shop in Lower Manhattan. They eventually settled around 28th and 29th Streets, which in the early part of the 20th century was considered Tin Pan Alley, and it was composer-writer Monroe H. Rosenfeld who allegedly gave the publishing block its ignominious name. And it has stuck, although it's more used as a catchphrase than an actual location, and originally it was considered the location rather than the genre. So, who was Monroe Rosenfeld, and what did he write? Well, we'll get to that in a minute. If you look at this map, and if you don't have it particularly enlarged, I can give you some hints. This is for considering the career of E.T. Paul, who was one of the Tin Pan Alley composers and publishers. But if you look in the lower part, this is Lower Manhattan, 20 East 17th Street is where he was, and then 119 Fifth Avenue. The Whitmark brothers originally started out right around this location, and this is in the 1890s. But by the early 1900s, 1900 to 1905, if you look at where the purple is, that's Tin Pan Alley, and it was essentially a 2-block area along 28th Street and 29th Street. And this is where many of the publishers had gathered, so their offices would be in the same places, resources, print jobbers, anything that they needed. And composers literally could walk up and down the street and sell their wares to the publishers. If one didn't like it, they could go to the next one until they succeeded, if they would succeed at all. It was an easier business at a time when Everyone was trying to compete and say, get the most songs out there, the most topical songs, the sinking of the Maine, or the Titanic, or the election of a new president, or the coming of the telephone, all these things, music on demand. By 1910, 1911, they had migrated up to near the top where you see 42nd Street. That's the Broadway district. It was necessary for them to be there to sell where the major musicians were and singers at that time. It was on Broadway, and it was easier to court them when you didn't have to go 2.5 miles to Midtown to get to them. And then that last one, it points more or less to the Brill Building, the green sign, and that's where Tin Pan Alley would end. But again, Monroe Rosenfeld wrote these pieces, and they're all just sensational sellers. The Coming Woman, Remember Your Father and Mother, I Loved You Once, I Scorn You Now, I'll Never Let You Press My Lips Again. Boy, with all her faults, I love her still. She was happy till she met you. And then the great one with the guy with a gun on the cover, good grief, those wedding bells shall not ring out. So Monroe Rosenfeld knew something about writing songs that some segments of the public wanted to hear. And these were in the gay 90s. Well, ragtime came along, and he was somewhat outmoded, so he became a writer in the newspaper instead, and did this wonderful article, The Ragtime Songster, Go Way Back and Sit Down, where he discusses how to write a ragtime song. This is an indication, of course, that ragtime, while many of us in the 1970s, 1980s, and even more recently have thought of it as piano rags by Scott Joplin or George Botsford, James Scott, or whoever, actually it was more the genre of the time, the genre of the era. So ragtime overall included the songs, and what he was making fun here is not just of the music, which of course many people scorned and then would go secretly home and listen to the piano rolls and records so nobody else would know that they actually liked it. And he just said that they were becoming lazy and using catchphrases, and if you want to maybe look and freeze a screenshot for later, or you can write to me and I can send you a clip of the original. So it was scorned even by those in Tin Pan Alley. Now we're getting into the meat. Where do we talk about the women? This is Florence Clinton Sutro. There's a household name. Actually, among a few people in the early 1900s, she was. And yes, she's moving. I embrace technology. There's new technology out that allows me to create these animations. So enjoy them. It sort of brings the people alive. Anyway, Florence Clinton Sutro was, let's say, more of an advisor and more of a writer than she was songs, although she did quite a bit of music. And this is from an article that she published in 1898, which is going to be the basis of where I go from here. So please allow me to read this in case the text is small, but it says a lot, and we'll discuss. When I was a very small girl, I'm not going to do her voice. When I was a very small girl, I heard my father remark, women are constantly practicing the piano and there is not an important composer among the sex. This proves that women's brains are not as capable of development as the brains of men. I wondered in childish fashion at the reason for this and immediately set out about discovering women's compositions. Later on, I referred my father's opinion to a man of learning and eminence, an honored graduate of Harvard and other universities. He answered, as a matter of course, oh yes, women's brains are deficient. Your father was right in informing you that women are quite incapable of composing music. Still, I was perplexed, and I addressed myself to Mr. Harrison Millard, the well-known composer. He replied, women will never become composers of music. They lack the creative quality. This last opinion, I found out, was considered an axiom. So you can see right now that there's a huge social hurdle for women getting a publisher even interested in her work. because she goes in where they have a preconceived notion that women were just not capable of music. But why? We dig further to another part of this article. I searched through the New York libraries. I discovered but one book on the subject of women in music. Naturally delighted at my find, you can imagine my disappointment and surprise when I read in its pages the positive assertion that women could never become composers or creators of this divine art. I found also an essay titled Women in Music, written for the Philadelphia Exposition, which was held in 1876. It contained the names of 11 composers, but their works were not mentioned. There was a book entitled Women's Work in America by Annie Nathan Meyer, written in 1891. This book of women in education, literature, journalism, ministry, law, state, industry, and even philanthropy, but not a word about women composers. Well, this gets curiouser and curiouser. She was, I believe, one of the first researchers who really set out to not only find women who could compose, but prove that they were viable in what they did. If women like George Eliot, aka Mary Ann Evans, and Mrs. Elizabeth Barrett Browning have penetrated to the depths of thought and displayed the strongest kind of intellect in literature, and women like Maria Mitchell and Caroline Herschel in astronomy and mathematics, and others in every other branch of mental activity, we need no further proof that the female mind is capable of the highest original efforts in music. In the field of musical composition, the very fact that women grasp matters by instinct and emotion rather than by reason would give her a great advantage over men, provided her mind is trained as well as theirs in other respects. This fine intuitive sense of what is beautiful, appropriate, and harmonious should produce greater results in musical composition if added to the trained and disciplined intellect than might be expected of the intellect alone. In many ways, this is somewhat like what Scott Joplin was espousing when he wrote Treemonisha, is that Black people can be just as productive and great members of society as white people, which of course we have since found out is quite true. All they need is equal opportunity, equal education. And this, unfortunately, just was not all that common. Women were sent off to a finishing school. Not all of them got properly finished, so it was, but they still had this uphill battle wanting to become a lawyer or even a songwriter. And the common workplace then was, let's say, sweatshops where they would make clothes, or you work in a millinery where they made hats, and it all had to do with women's things, and they just couldn't be in the industrial world or the business world, and music was considered an up-and-coming industry. So if they'd had the proper musical training, and there were a handful of women who did in the 1880s and 1890s, then perhaps they would have been prevalent a lot sooner. Fortunately, things did change right at the turn of the century. So let's look at one of the early composers and where she made it big, Ida M. Emerson, Howard Hills. Now you'll see when I put the names here, there are a lot of names. I'm putting all the names they accumulated throughout their lives. Some of them are very long, and some of them are very brief. Those are women usually who did not marry, and those who married as many as 8 or 9 times. I think we'll see some of the moderation here, 5 or 6. But Ida M. Emerson, Howard. The Howard is important. That was her husband of the time, her first husband, who you will know as Joe Howard. Together, they made it big around 1900 when they wrote, "Hello, Ma Baby." Hello, Ma Baby, my gal has left me. Now, there's been some arguments as to how much Ida contributed to the music, but given that she had some successes after Joe Howard left her, that's likely that she contributed quite a bit. Anyway, her name was on the cover, but if you look carefully, Howard and Emerson on the first two, you only see last names, because sometimes women had to go undercover, as it were. They'd use an initial or some kind of pen name, or just obliterate their first name to begin with, because they didn't want to be ignored simply because they were a woman. And this unfortunately did happen. It happened to black composers too, often when their pictures were on the cover. But I mean, you can look at some of the songs there at the bottom that she did. Joe Howard was, I think in the end, sorry he left her, wrote a song for her in 1909 that was very predictive for him. I wonder who's kissing her now, and I believe he actually was. Well, do you remember this guy? This is where the piece shines.
Hello, my baby. Hello, my honey. Hello, my ragtime gal. Send me a kiss by wire. Baby, my heart's on fire. If you refuse me, honey, you lose me. Then you'll be left alone. Oh, baby, telephone and tell me I'm your own.
Now, that cartoon was produced 55 years after the piece was written. It's still a favorite of many people. They made a sequel to it several years ago. One Froggy Evening is the name, if you want to look it up. And I highly recommend it because there's several good old songs in there. But that's the one that most people remember. If you've seen Spaceballs, you've seen it there as well. In fact, I think the second Looney Tunes movie with Brendan Fraser, they had it. Moving forward to our next magical act here. I'm going to talk about social obstacles that women had. Now, what I'm quoting from was written during the first decade of the 20th century. So there were people who were somewhat sympathetic to the plight of women, but they could also explain some of the obstacles that they had to go through. Although the women may have just as much talent as the men, it is not to be expected that their songs and music numbers ever will become as genuinely popular as are those of the men. The men have this advantage. For the purpose of plugging, which is the term used by the profession for popularizing their new creations, men can go where they please, when they please, stay out as late as they please, without shattering any of the traditions of propriety. The women, however, cannot do this. I think you see where this is going, because now if everybody is equal, they can do these things equally, but women were overly protected at that time. Not protective, protective. Imagine a woman songwriter standing at a stage door until she can converse with some masculine performer and impress upon him that she has the one song that will make his act. Imagine her running around until 1 o'clock or later in the morning, leaving orchestrations of her latest with the orchestra and piano players of the good, bad, and indifferent cafes. She can't do it, and it isn't expected of her. There are but two of the many things she can't do to push her song. Of course, her work is placed ultimately where it will do the most good, but it isn't given the close attention the men can pay to their own screeds, or of course, those written by their own kind. Despite these handicaps, however, the writings of women songmakers are growing more popular with each succeeding year, and it is only a question of a little while when their work will stand on an equally sound footing with the ditties of men. And if we look a couple of years ago, it was a woman who won a Golden Globe, I think possibly, well, I know she was Oscar nominated, for writing the scores of two movies, one of those being The Joker. Now, this is November 17th, 1907 in Chicago, but I believe that was a syndicated article, so it was seen pretty widely. Here's someone who got around some of the social articles and social obstacles by just becoming big. You know her as Nora Bayes, but her full name, Rachel Eleonora Dora Nora. You can see where the Nora came from. Goldberg Bayes, that was her birth name, more or less, somewhere in there. Gressing, her first married name. Norworth, a name you might recognize. Clark and Gordon. So, yeah, she had 4 or 5 marriages there. Anyway, Bayes and Norworth were a big deal in the Ziegfeld Follies. They were there from the beginning of the Ziegfeld Follies. And in fact, for the first or second year, they wrote this ditty, Shine On Harvest Moon, which many of you will recognize. Now, Nora actually did the music for a lot of these. Jack Norworth was more the lyricist. She could write music and lyrics and did well. There were pieces written for her and by her as well, such as the Nora Bayes Foxtrot. She was a big deal. But the thing that she became most known for was not a song that she wrote, yet she was the first one to perform it at a critical time in American history, and that would be Over There, Over There. And you can see the rest of them underneath. She was on the first cover of Over There, which is, by the way, I believe the only song written by George M. Cohan that was not intended for one of his stage shows. It was that big a deal. He was asked by President Wilson to contribute something because who more patriotic than Mr. Cohan? And we still hear it now and then, a century later. Jean Veronica Perring Lennox Sutton. Yes, Jean Lennox was also known largely for her lyrics, but she did write some music. And she wrote with Mr. Harry Sutton. Now, she has two names there, which is interesting. Well, the Lennox, not sure exactly where that came from. It was an invented name. The Perring was her maiden name, and Sutton, she got that twice. From what I understand, she married Harry Sutton in 1904. Then they quickly divorced as soon as it hit the papers. She wanted to be known as strong and fiercely independent. They got remarried under her maiden name of Veronica Perring and Harry Sutton. And the illusion was maintained in the newspapers up to the time of Harry's untimely death in the early 1910s that they were not married, that they were simply song partners, that Harry was married to someone else when he was, in fact, married to Miss Lennox or Perring. You can see some of their big hits there and some of their smaller hits. They were popular, but unfortunately Harry left the world and she lived another several years before she died. In fact, many of the family members died from, I'm not sure exactly what it was, I think it was tuberculosis. It was going around. She died in Washington, D.C. around 1919 or 1920. Now, if you look at the name also, Jean Lennox, Jean is one of those names that can go either way. Jean Schwartz was a male writer. And there was an incident where Jean was invited to a party, and so was a person named Jean Lennox, who was there to talk about the music business and all the songs he'd written. So the hostess, when she found out who was who, the woman Jean, she just said, no, let this play out. And so he started talking about the music business and his big hits and so on. And then she stood up and said, so why don't you play us one of your numbers? And said, well, I'm not prepared. I need the music to do this. I said, okay, fine. So she sent her houseboy or whoever to her apartment, which was not far off, to get some music while he kept talking, and then brought it back, dumped it on the piano. He stared at it, could not read a note, could not figure it out. And that's when she said, so did you know that Jean Lennox was a woman and that she's standing in front of you, sat down, started playing, and the guy was instantly booted out. So that's among the things that women had to deal with at that time. Even having their identities blatantly stolen. It's quite a story. She was quite a lady. Now, blatantly sexist perceptions. That's where I was going with this. That was the one of her. So here's from another fine article. At last the secret is out. The reason why women cannot compose such good music as men. Philip Hale has discovered it in the London Referee. An extremely gallant writer in that periodical argues it out in this way. Women has been, or indirectly man's constant source of inspiration. How then can inspiration inspire itself? In other words, men think so much more highly of women than women think of men. That women have not the same source of power. Moving on, nearly all the most beautiful melodies in the world have come into being through the composer's effort to express his ideal woman. The same effect is noticeable in a man's piano playing of passages of amorous and delicate sentiment. It is seldom one hears them interpreted with such intense tenderness by a woman. The man is expressing an ideal. Believe it or not, there's more. The suffragettes are evidently right, says Henry T. Fink, the musical critic. Men are inferior beings. After reading the above, however, mere man will surely try to improve himself, were it only in order to improve the music composed by woman. So I have one of these examples here. Those of you who are familiar with classic ragtime will likely enjoy this. It was written by a woman, and as far as I'm concerned, it's every bit as much classic ragtime as many men wrote. That piece is Affinity Rag, something I have a particularly nice affinity for, the Affinity Rag. I've enjoyed playing that for many years. Yes, it was written by Irene Kozad, a woman composer, and it really stands up. It's got 4 brilliant sections throughout, and well, you'll hear it in concert hopefully next year if you come and spend some time with us in Sedalia. Let's talk about Blanche Merrill, who's done stuff that you know. Blanche Merrill made it by understanding women. She was, of course, a woman, but she understood what their needs were. She also understood what was funny and what was not and what would ping on stage. So her vessel was not as a performer, but as going through the performers. This first one here, Eva Tanguay, think of her as the Lady Gaga or the Madonna of her kind. Tanguay was known for a song called I Don't Care, which you may have heard Judy Garland sing in a film long ago. She went out on stage once wearing a costume. No, it wasn't made of all meat like Lady Gaga. It was made of dollar bills. But that got some tasty reviews in the paper, and she would cavort on stage and look as sexy as possible. So Blanche Merrill knew how to write for her and give her the material she loved, and therefore got a contract. Well, a few years later, this is 1906-7 when Blanche started writing when she was in high school, and in 1910 is when Tanguay got a hold of her. Soon after that, she was contacted by Fanny Brice, said, "You got anything for me?" So Blanche said yes, and she again wrote mostly lyrics, but did write several things with melodies. Jake, the Yiddish ball player, was written with Irving Berlin. So that's pretty good creds right there. And then for the next decade, into the early 1920s, Blanche became one of the primary providers of material, not just the songs, but also some of the sketches for Fanny Brice during her stint with the Ziegfeld Follies and when she occasionally went out on her own. Then in the 1920s, she came up with a hit called Jazz Baby, which is still heard on Broadway. It was that good. So you really need good lyrics to suggest the music that's going along with it. And Blanche Merrill was quite capable of doing that. And you can see some of them on there, like The Dying Swan. That was a big hit for Fanny Brice. My Syncopated Melody Man, many of you have seen or heard that. The Tanguay Tangle, another for Eva Tanguay. Blanche Merrill went on in the 1920s, the mid-1920s, to California and was writing scenarios before they had scripts for films. And then she started writing vaudeville sketches on the West Coast, from 1925 to 1929, went over to London and wrote there for a couple of years, came back to New York and started peddling her wares for radio. One of the people she ran into along the way was Imogene Coca, who she wrote for in the early 1940s, and Blanche was therefore brought on to Your Show of Shows in 1951, which of course was headed by that gallant, goofy comedian, that would be Sid. So Sid and Imogene, Sid Caesar is who I'm thinking of. Sid and Imogene were on the television thanks to Blanche providing them material. After 9 months, Blanche said, "This is dumb. I'm writing some of the stupidest stuff in the world because that's what Sid Caesar likes." And so she ended up not wanting to do that anymore and quit show business altogether, thanks to Sid Caesar, who more or less kicked her out of the door with good riddance. But she was successful. She never married, and she became her own person through that. Now, here's another woman who actually made a man famous, if you can imagine that. Cora May Folsom Salisbury Allman. Now, she was fiercely independent too, which is why she had 2 husbands, among other reasons. But Cora May Folsom was not only a decent writer of rags, you can see the Poodles Parade, it's okay. Lemons and Limes, I play that a lot. Ghost Dance, one of her more famous pieces. But she was also a vaudeville performer, spent a lot of time out on the road with various acts, including one that she discovered in her home, Oshkosh, Wisconsin. He was a young lad named Benny Kubelski, and he played the violin. He was a classical violin player. Well, they went out with their act, and it turns out there was another violinist whose name was very close to that, Benny Kubelski, so they had to change it. They ended up changing his name 3 times until they settled on Jack Benny. And to the end of his life, Jack Benny thanked Cora Folsom Salisbury for getting him his start on the stage and career when he was in his teens. She had to promise Kubelski's father that she would take good care of him and make sure he didn't get in any mixers and didn't mix with any woman, because Jack was from, of course, a devoutly Jewish family. You just didn't go into show business like that. So his father had less to do with his fame than did Cora. And now we move to a name that's familiar to anyone who's heard female composers played in Sedalia, May Frances Aufderheide, who was later married to a Kaufman. She's looking at us there. Now, I know that some of these covers are very dicey. I do not endorse any of the images on this cover, of any of these covers. They are there simply because we're trying to present historical context. I would never want to publicly display these for any other reason except for that context, to know what we were dealing with at the time. We know what we were dealing with at the time. However, this was unfortunately common, and that's how they sold the pieces back then. The works, though, speak for themselves. May Aufderheide wrote some very fine works, and she influenced a man as well. It was her father. May had a friend of hers help her typeset one of her first pieces, and then he printed it. He was a fledgling printer, did about 500 copies, and they distributed it around Indianapolis. This was after her father had sent her to finish school. She came back unfinished, and he was rather upset with her and said, "Why can't you just be an ordinary girl?" She says, "Because I love ragtime." And when he saw that Dusty was gathering dust on the shelves and that she was still writing and was going to do this no matter what, he started the John H. Aufderheide Publishing Company. So yeah, there was an influence there. The daughter, so for the love of his daughter, he created one of the better firms in Indianapolis, which was later sold off to a Chicago firm, and also brought in several other composers, including Paul Pratt, who wrote some fine rags, The Hothouse Rag, of course, is one of his that we know. And Les Copeland, who almost became a pianist, I think, I'm thinking of J. Russell Robinson, also from Indianapolis, and he became a pianist briefly for the original Dixieland Jazz Band after their first pianist died. So the Indianapolis ragtime movement, or at least the availability of being able to distribute it, Mae Francis Aufderheide was responsible for that, in part. Then there's Charlotte Blake. She was a prolific writer to a degree for a woman composer, and she was from Detroit, Michigan. First company that she worked for was Whitney Warner, which was bought and reformed by Jerome H. Remick, who eventually became one of the larger publishers in New York City. She stayed in Detroit. You can see there's the Poker Rag, which we heard opening of this show, the Poker Rag, that Tired Rag, Missouri Mule March, and several other pieces that are down there at the bottom. On her earliest pieces, as you can see on the Missouri Mule March, you may have to squint a little, it was written by C. Blake. I don't know if that was her choice or the publisher's choice, but again, it was just hard to sell something with a woman's name on it. But once she became famous in the trade papers and had a local following in Detroit and further out, she revealed her name. So she was a pioneer as well, and just a solid writer. And as she flies off into the distance there, we talk another one, which sort of a tragedy, but interesting. Billy Brown. This is one of many women composers who, and I mean no malice by this, but they just couldn't get their stories straight. They would constantly lie about their age. In this case, I think it was Billy Brown's mother. That she was adopted, and her mother, who helped her write Lonesome Mama Blues, which you see there, constantly misreported her age to the press. Well, unfortunately, she died in 1919. It wasn't of the flu. It was another malady. And her mother tried to keep this alive by claiming at the time of her death she was 18, not 27, which was her actual age. This Aloha was first published in about 1913 or 14, and it was variations on Aloha Oi. And yes, Queen Liliuokalani has to be in a larger, broader discussion of women in ragtime, because she influenced a lot of composers just with Aloha and maybe 3 or 4 other pieces that were published in the United States, and she was greatly popular, the most popular queen of that era for certain. So with her Dangerous Blues, Billy Brown got very close to jazz, and it was played by several famous jazz artists in the 1920s. Unfortunately, she did not live to see that, but that was part of Kansas City. Then we have the businesswoman, Carrie Jacobs Bond, who came from almost nothing. She married a guy she should not have married, but she had her heart set on Dr. Bond. And after she married him, he died. She was left a widow. And she and her son started this publishing empire in Chicago in the late 1890s on borrowed money. She drew her own covers. She did all of the work and formed an office and marketed it and marketed and marketed. And as a result, Carrie Jacobs Bond became the first millionaire publisher who was a woman. She moved out to Hollywood, California in the 1920s. Her son, he went through a lot of pressure being her son, and unfortunately, he ended up committing suicide in the late 1930s, just outside of Los Angeles, and she spent several years trying to connect with the occult to connect with him, and found out it was all a sham and was disillusioned. But she was a famous citizen of Los Angeles and was peripherally involved with the founding of the Hollywood Bowl and some of the music societies in Los Angeles, and was somewhat of a philanthropist at that. Well, now we have one of the heartbreak stories, Reva Marie Rich Tonelli. Well, Reva Marie Rich, this is before she was married. When girls were presented to society at age 16 or 17, the young soubrettes, they were given coming out parties, It was a big deal made. You're a woman now. Well, one of the things that she wanted at her coming out party was to present her own work as a composer, and her daddy complied. And if you look at this, La Petite Boston, those of you who can read music, I did not record this, but if you can read music, you can see that looks like a fine rag, and it really is. It's a very competent piece written by a 16-year-old at the time, but she did a good job with it and had it published just in time for the party. But somebody got a detail wrong. We don't know if it was the Starmer brothers who drew the cover. We don't know if it was the print jobber. You can see inside it just says La Petite Boston. It doesn't say rag, doesn't say two-step. It was a two-step and a rag. On the cover, La Petite Boston Waltz. Now, imagine your ragtime lover going into a music store. They don't want waltzes anymore. Yeah, there were people who wanted them. They see waltz, they're just going to pass it by and not even open it up. Not interested. I want the latest ragtime hit. And that had to be a crushing blow to Miss Rich when she saw this. There was a second edition printed with a correction, and it did have two-step on the cover. But by then the damage had been done and the piece became old. So, yeah, there was heartbreak. There was heartbreak all over the country. I'm just covering those who were known on Tin Pan Alley. And of course, Tin Pan Alley by this time had spread out to several centers in the country, not just New York. Now we go to a woman who actually got me started in this. Her name was Fanny B. Woods, Fanny Bell Woods. And in 1912, she wrote a little piece called Sweetness, which was carried by the Forster Company. She lived in Louisville. Forster was in Chicago. But it was a very fine rag, and it was a rag, a good one. Many of us have played it over the years. However, there was an association accidentally between her and Charles Leslie Johnson, the writer of Dill Pickles, among other things. Comeback Rag and Blue Goose Rag, some great pieces. However, Fanny was not Charles Johnson, and I got notified many years ago from a student of hers, why are you saying that Charles Johnson wrote my piano teacher's rag? And when I looked into it, I found out her history, but it took years to unravel the mystery of how this happened. Well, if you look inside or on the back cover of many pieces, you'll see an advertisement like this. And these are templates. They're put on several pieces of music. This was on Sweetness. No, it wasn't on Sweetness. It was on another Charles Johnson rag. But by the popular writer of Syncopated Melodies, Fanny Woods. We don't know of any others that she wrote, but she evidently was a popular writer of Syncopated Melodies. And you can see there's Sweetness, and that is the accurate music, good ragtime two-step. Now, a few months later, on a different copy of music, and this is, again, where women could get overlooked, you can see Tar Babies has been put in the place of Sweetness, but that's all that has changed. It still says, by the popular writer of Syncopated Melodies, Fanny Woods, and yet, if you look closely, it says Charles Johnson, who wrote this, not Fanny Woods. But somebody somehow got this confused, and even the wife of F.J.A. Forster, the publisher, at one point, she was confused by this too. How could this have possibly happened? She was gone long before I could shed any light on this subject. But this is how we think it got cast as a Charles L. Johnson song, was an advertisement like this. Well, I'm glad that mystery is straightened out, and so is Fanny. You can see right there, it was respectfully dedicated to Mr. W.J. Mansfield, William J. Mansfield, who she ended up marrying. And here she is in the 1950s at her favorite instrument, the organ. Wonderful two-manual electronic organ. Well, there's the tale of Fanny Woods. There were changes in Tin Pan Alley, of course, after the 1920s. So we look at what happened. Publishers moved to the theater district around 42nd Street, as I'd mentioned, around 1910. Cover art became less prominent and celebrity pictures more prevalent. So if you look at the standard size sheets of the 20s and 30s, you will see a lot of templating that has several titles and one of them is highlighted. and you will also see who sang this song or who played this, or sometimes the composer, such as in the case of Zez Confrey. So all the covers that look the same, a little bit less interesting, a bit more Art Deco. The Great Depression greatly hurt the business, and many companies folded and they consolidated to the Brill Building, which is what you see in the background of the slide there. And the Brill Building is more or less where Tin Pan Alley went to die. It thrived in the 30s through the 1950s. Singers, songwriters, and self-starters, however, in the age of rock and roll, made career songwriters all but irrelevant. Well, some of them have come back. Do you know that Meghan Trainor originally started out with encouragement from her dad, learning how to write songs, and was writing for other people? Glenn Campbell was writing songs. Chris Christopherson, great songwriter. Barry Manilow, before they started performing them themselves. So it has come back. But the real last occupants of the Brill Building, who gave us some great hits in the 50s, were Carole King, Jerry Goffin. There's Lieber and Stoller, who wrote a lot of Elvis hits. And at the bottom, Come Down, Doobie Doo Down Down, Neil Sedaka. I got to meet him many years ago. It was such a thrill to play his white piano, which was only for classical music, but that was a great time. And Lieber and Stoller, they're responsible for Don't Be Cruel and Hound Dog and some other, well, okay. And Carole King, you know what became of her, and now she's a stage musical. And there you have it. So, in the end, this is what's coming up. Encyclopedia of Female Composers of Popular Music. This is the index of those who wrote popular music. Again, let me define that. Those would not just be piano rags, but polkas and two-steps and popular waltzes and things that you would more or less hear when you were going to dances. This was not the parlor type music. A lot of these names will look familiar, and as you can see, many of them are rather long because I have all the married names on there. That's just how it's presented. They made alphabetical order kind of difficult. It made researching them almost impossible because not all of these women are properly documented. Sometimes all you have is a sheet of music with their name on it, and you have to work from there. It might be a married name. It might be their maiden name, and then they got married immediately, and you can't find them in census records as a result. So this was a long search. I did 532 in the end, and of those, I think only 17 or 18 I wasn't able to collect any serious demographics on. So if anybody knows who Kate Cairo with 2 Ks is, please let me know so we can fill that in. It's in the editing stage. It's been had a redo recently, so back in the editing stage for publishing. There will be illustrations throughout. We're hoping it will be in electronic form as well as print form. And yes, this is a long list. And these are the ones who wrote the popular music. Anybody look familiar there? Yes, indeed. And then I have an appendix on there, which is people who wrote classical or, well, little fantasies, fantasias, parlor works, the type that you don't play unless you're at, and this is not casting anything improperly, if you were at a women's gathering, women's music club or something. So there's many less of them, but I was surprised to find over 200, much less over 500. So it was a wonderful journey. I hope you have enjoyed this journey with me. I appreciate you being here. And to that I say, long live Tin Pan Alley, and hurrah for all the talented women who were part of it. Thanks for tuning in and for staying around, or for watching this again on repeat, streaming. Hopefully it'll be out here for a while. Let your friends know. And thank you for tuning in to the Scott Joplin International Ragtime Festival 2021.